in Hollywood, a small percentage written into the right contract can be worth more than an enormous salary. And that is what makes Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer deal so interesting. Because the famous part of the story is not just that he made a lot of money. Directors of massive hit films make a lot of money all the time. The interesting part is how he made it. According to reports, Nolan negotiated 15% of first dollar gross on Oppenheimer. And that one clause reportedly turned into about $85 million gross. That is the story. Not a larger upfront fee, not a normal bonus. A percentage. A small-looking number attached to a very big machine. And once that machine worked, the result became enormous. To understand why this is such a big deal, you first have to understand how unusual Christopher Nolan's position was. By the time Oppenheimer was made, Nolan was not just another director looking for work. He was one of the few filmmakers in the world whose name alone could sell a movie. That is rare. Most movies are sold by stars, franchises, brands, or intellectual property. Batman, Marvel, Fast and Furious, Jurassic Park, Mission Impossible. The audience often buys the franchise first and the filmmaker second. But Nolan became something different. He became the brand. People do not just watch a Christopher Nolan film, they go because it is a Christopher Nolan film. That kind of leverage changes contract negotiations. Because once your name is helping to finance, market, and de-risk the project itself, you are no longer just selling labour. You are selling value. And value gets negotiated differently. Nolan had already built that leverage over years. Memento made him respected. The Dark Knight trilogy made him commercially powerful. Inception proved he could take an original idea and turn it into a giant global event. Dunkirk proved he could make an intense historical film feel massive, and by the time his relationship with Warner Brothers soured, he had become one of the few directors who could realistically walk into another studio and demand extraordinary terms. That matters because Oppenheimer was not an obvious franchise blockbuster. It was a serious historical drama about J. Robert Oppenheimer, atomic development, moral responsibility, and the making of the bomb. On paper, that is not the easiest movie in the world to sell as a giant theatrical event. And yet Nolan was the person who could make a studio believe it was possible. That's the first hidden clause lesson in this story. Sometimes the contract term is not created by luck. It is created by years of accumulated leverage. By the time Oppenheimer was being packaged, Nolan was negotiating from a position very few filmmakers ever reach. Now let's get to the actual clause. The reported phrase attached to Nolan's deal was first dollar gross. That sounds technical, but the basic idea is simple. Usually when people hear that someone gets a percentage of a movie, they imagine profit participation. In other words, the film earns money, the studio recovers its costs, and then the participant gets a share of what is left. That is already a good deal if the movie succeeds. But first dollar gross is more powerful. It means the participant shares in revenue from the top, before the studio first recoups all of its expenses. That difference is enormous. Profit can be made to look small. Profit can be delayed. Profit can be reduced by accounting, distribution charges, marketing costs, overhead allocations, and all kinds of studio-side math. Revenue is much harder to hide, so if your contract gives you a percentage tied to first dollar gross rather than ordinary profit, the clause becomes far more valuable. And Nolan reportedly got 15%. That is the number that matters, not 1%, not 2%, not a tiny symbolic slice, 15%. If Oppenheimer had underperformed, that clause would have been far less impressive. But then something unusual happened. A 3-hour historical drama about atomic science became a cultural event. The movie did not just perform well, it exploded. It became one of the defining theatrical events of its year. People debated it, memed it, discussed it online, watched it in premium large format theatres, watched it again. And suddenly the small-looking percentage in Nolan's contract was attached to a very large number. That is where the story becomes pure one small clause. Because once the movie became a hit, the clause stopped looking like a detail and started looking like the whole story. Reportedly, that 15% participation turned into about $85 million gross. Just pause on that for a second. $85 million from one contractual participation term. Not because Nolan accidentally discovered extra money later, not because the studio got generous afterward, because the clause was negotiated in advance. That is the entire difference. The money was not a surprise windfall, it was the mathematical consequence of the agreement. And this is why really elite people in film do not only fight over salary, a salary is limited, a percentage scales. If Nolan had pushed for a larger fixed directing fee, he might have guaranteed himself more money up front. But a fixed fee has a ceiling. A participation term rides the movie upward. If the film becomes larger than expected, the clause becomes larger too. That's exactly what happened here. Now, this kind of deal does not come out of nowhere. Studios do not hand out first dollar gross participation just because someone asks politely. A clause like that usually reflects power. It means the studio needs you badly enough that it is willing to give up a more valuable share of the upside. And that tells you something important about Nolan's status. Universal was not simply paying for a director, it was paying for confidence. Confidence that Nolan could turn a difficult, serious subject into a major theatrical success. Confidence that his name would attract audiences. Confidence that exhibitors would support the film. Confidence that awards momentum, cultural conversation, and prestige would all feed the event. In other words, the studio was not only buying the movie, it was buying Nolan's ability to make the movie feel unmissable. And when a person has that level of leverage, the smartest contracts often stop focusing on guaranteed money alone. They focus on upside. That is what a small clause does best. It takes the future and writes a claim on it. The fascinating thing is that to an ordinary person, the words first dollar gross can easily pass by without sounding dramatic. They do not sound like $85 million. They sound like legal jargon. That's often how the most powerful clauses work. The loud part of a contract is usually the headline salary. The quiet part is the structure. And structure is where huge amounts of money can hide. Two contracts can both announce a big directing fee, but the one with the right back-end participation can end up being in a completely different universe. That's why this is such a clean story for the channel. At first glance, 15% looks like a detail, but once the film succeeds, that detail becomes the main event. There is another reason this story matters. It shows the difference between being paid as an employee and being paid like a partner. A normal salary pays you for the work. A strong participation clause lets you share in the result. Nolan was not only being compensated for directing the movie, he was sharing in what the movie became. That is a much more powerful position. And it also explains why people at the very top fight so hard over back-end terms. Because once your work can generate hundreds of millions of dollars, a simple salary can start to look small. Even a very large salary can look small. Let's imagine the contrast. Suppose someone offered a giant fixed fee, 10 million, 15 million, 20 million. For almost everyone on Earth, that is absurd money. But if the film becomes a true global phenomenon, the fixed fee stops growing. The percentage keeps moving. That is what makes participation dangerous for the studio and magical for the person who negotiated it. If the project becomes bigger than expected, the clause compounds the success. And that success becomes expensive. There is also a broader lesson here about creative leverage. People often think contract power comes from aggression. Sometimes it does, but often it comes from scarcity. The reason Nolan can command extraordinary terms is not that he argues harder than everyone else. It is that there are very few people who can do what he does at the same level. Studios can replace most people. They cannot easily replace a filmmaker whose name alone can move audience behaviour worldwide. That scarcity is what turns a request into a realistic demand. And once scarcity is real, the negotiation changes. This is also why the story works beyond Hollywood. Even if you do not care about movies, the principle is universal. If you create enough value, you stop negotiating only for payment today. You start negotiating for a share of what your work creates tomorrow. That is the leap. Salary is payment for effort. Participation is payment for outcome. The bigger the outcome, the more powerful the clause. Of course, these deals also carry risk. If Oppenheimer had disappointed, that 15% would not look nearly as legendary. A participation clause is only as powerful as the thing it is attached to. A percentage of a failure can be worth less than a guaranteed fee. That is what makes clauses like this so interesting. They transfer risk and upside at the same time. The studio gives up more future value. The filmmaker accepts that the giant payoff depends on giant success. In Nolan's case, the bet worked. The film connected, the audience showed up, the event grew larger, and the clause did what powerful clauses do. It quietly turned success into a massive personal payday. And that is why the Oppenheimer deal is such a perfect example of one small clause changing everything. Because most people will remember the number, $85 million. But the real story is not the number. The real story is the structure. The value was not hiding in a flashy headline. It was hiding in the contract language. 15%. First dollar gross. A few technical words. And inside those words was a completely different financial result. That is what elite negotiators understand. The biggest money is not always in the obvious place. Sometimes it is not the salary. Sometimes it is not the bonus. Sometimes it is one short clause that connects your name to the upside. For Christopher Nolan, that clause reportedly turned Oppenheimer into an $85 million contract story. And that is how one small clause can change everything. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to One Small Clause for more videos about contracts, ownership, lawsuits, and the hidden rules that shape real lives. And if you want another story right now, tap one of the videos on screen.